Okay, you have your drawing board set up. And one thing that is a little tricky is to get your paper under the clamps of your drawing board. I can show you how to do that. These open up really wide. So first what I do is I put it up into one of the clamps, kind of all the way in. I try to keep this edge parallel. You can see that it's not right now. So I'll adjust it a little bit more. Okay, now it's parallel along this edge. Then I carefully bend the paper, being very careful not to crease it. I open this clamp all the way wide. I lay it in there. So far so good. The paper this is the thicker paper, so it sort of stays in place. But I think that it's nice to anchor it with some of your artist tape along the edge. And now you're ready to go. I've chosen 5 objects that are different shapes, different values, different sizes. Okay, so now I have my drawing. Just like I have instructed you to have 5 objects set up. You can make them any scale. They can be anywhere on the page. So I've done that. But the drawing is sort of boring. What are the reasons for that? Well, all the line quality is pretty similar. The objects are spaced out in a very even way, and nothing is overlapping. So let's just start with line quality. One way that you can manipulate line quality that you may not even think about is with your eraser. You have this great tool, which is the mechanical eraser in a plastic sleeve. So say I want to make this little dog go back in space more. I can erase across the drawing in even parallel marks. Get rid of that. And sort of soften the line quality so that it's different than that. And this little form starts to recede. So that's one way to do it. The other, perhaps more obvious way, is by making some of these lines much darker. So that you have a big contrast between this way that this form starts to come forward because the line is so dark and wide, and this form, which is now quite faint and pushes back into space. Okay, so now I've started to develop some changes in the way that line affects the way that something comes forward. This dark line comes forward, this erased line goes back, and I'm now making lines that are bigger than the point of my pencil. And I'm doing that by simply drawing the line in so that it's wide and dark. Much more dramatic that way. Now, the next thing I have to consider is maybe I could make something overlap. Let's see what would happen with that. So instead of having these glasses out here floating in Nowhereville, let's just put them over something. So what if I was to draw them, say, down here, overlapping this picture? And they're so big, the way that I'm drawing them, that they'll overlap this shoe also. And they're even touching this little statue of a dog. And you can start to see by overlapping, you get a much more dynamic space. Like this line wants to come forward because it's dark, and yet this form seems to overlap that form. So there's a kind of tension that exists between these two different dynamics as they begin to overlap. The next thing to consider is scale. Everything is sort of the same size on this piece of paper, and I can make things very big or very small, and I haven't done that. So let's take an object, maybe the picture, and we're going to make it very big. We could even make it so big that it doesn't fit on the page, but let's just start by making it much larger. It will automatically overlap some of these other forms. And while I'm working, I'm also going to think about my line. I can vary my line a lot. I can ease up on it. I can make it very light. I can go back and forth over that line, make it very dark. In fact, a line can really be made in a way that's almost like a form. I could make a line, I would say that's about 1/2 inch wide. And this is where drawing from your shoulder facilitates being able to make these great big forms. That's really a game changer, to make something so big that it starts to really have an effect where these smaller, lighter drawn objects start to float in and out of different kinds of spaces. I can also make something very, very small. Let's take the shoe, for example. I can put the shoe right over here all by itself. And I can draw it in a way so that, again, the word that I would use is there's a tension, and another word is it's more dynamic. So to have a small little object like this, little piece like a staccato note right in the upper left-hand corner, and then we have this great big form drawn in a dark way, you start to create kind of rhythms that move throughout the drawing. We still have the whole upper right-hand side of the drawing to consider. So I would just continue to work, and I want you to think about these 3 things: line quality, overlapping, and scale. Another way to use a line or to develop a line is by making a series of marks within that line. So I've drawn this little statue of the dog, and in a kind of a light line, thin line, and I might want to come through, and I never just fill in the line. I continue to look at something, so it's going to be different. But say that, for example, I wanted to make a dotted line. I could change the dots or the marks so that when they go back into space, they become very small. And then you can see we're getting a lot of complication here that's just dissolving into a network of lines. And I may want to differentiate some of these marks. And again, to make it a more dynamic drawing, more tension between the different marks. Making some of these marks much smaller, closer together, changes the way that our eye moves across that line. Maybe I intersperse this dotted form with some longer, darker lines. Make this foot feel more like it's sitting on a ground plane. And now I start to have a drawing that has real differences in it, both of overlapping, the different kinds of marks, the sort of lines that I'm making, and the scale. One thing that this drawing doesn't yet have is it abides by the rectangle of the page. Nothing comes in off the edge. So that can make it look clustered and static in a way. So let's think about making, let's say, one of these elements, perhaps the telephone, come really big so that it comes in off the edge of the page. These marks that I'm making on the phone, I'm kind of bracketing them so there's a number of lines. I kind of thought that this has a kind of funny quality in making the phone look like maybe it's ringing. It's much more animated. And now what we start to have is a kind of choral event where one element is operating in conjunction with another. The whole page is starting to feel like it has a kind of rhythm to it. This really helped, having something run off the page. And I'm going to continue to work in that way so that the page will start to feel like it has a much more dynamic and energetic quality to it This also gives us something that's happening in the foreground. When something runs off the page, it doesn't necessarily need to be gigantic. It might be just a little indication of something coming in from off the stage in a way. So let's say that we have something maybe right over here because we have a big sort of uninterrupted area. And maybe we decide that we're going to put part of the dog in here. Almost feels like the dog is walking into the stage because we put him so far off and we've made him a sort of small size. Another thing is this upper right-hand corner is starting to look a little undynamic. One of the problems that I have, and you will have too, with having these clamps overlapping your paper is that we don't know where the edge of the drawing is. So I recommend with your ruler or freehand drawing a line here, and that indicates that's the edge of the drawing, not what we're not even able to attend to in the far reaches of underneath those clamps. Okay, so let's say we're going to have part of the shoe come in here. This is the edge of my drawing, so I'm stopping there. And now we're really starting to get a lot of elements that are overlapping and a sort of dynamic that exists between the pieces. Okay, now I'm almost finished with the drawing. I stand back and I look at it and I think, where can I make it more? Is there any area that seems a little static? I've drawn this little shoe down here and then I softened it by erasing through it. But when I got to the part that starts to overlap the picture, I didn't erase that line so that it feels like maybe it's almost a receding, and then here it starts to have two planes that come together where it darkens. I find this part of the drawing, I don't know, a little uninteresting, maybe a bit confusing spatially. So maybe I decide that a line can be any thickness you want it to be. It could be 1 inch thick. Again, we don't have a tool that will give us a 1 inch thick line, so I'm making the line by drawing it in. And I'm going to see how I like it if it just stays in the overlapped area. It's like a form that's detached from this form. I'm not sure that I entirely like it. Maybe what I'll do is I'll change it to a dotted line so it's still wide and it's still connected, but it's not so abrupt. This is where you can begin to see what an effective tool your eraser is. I decided that this was too complicated, that line was too dark, so I made this a much bigger, wider line. And I also am now starting to experiment with what kind of line I can get by using my eraser to shape that line. In this case, I'm going with the line instead of how I was erasing something out by going across the form. And that makes this sharper, and it makes the line, again, more distinct and come forward more. All right, well, that's it for today. I think that you get the elements about line quality, overlapping, scale change, using your eraser to make a line, and basically just experimenting with your material. We're using a 6B pencil and a Mars eraser today. And I hope you enjoyed that.